Good morning, everybody. So today's video is about Gleichschaltung, as it was called, the process of coordination that happened in Germany. It started pretty much immediately after the Enabling Act, because the Enabling Act, which we covered in the previous lesson, gave Hitler these incredible powers to pass laws by himself. And as soon as he was armed with those powers, he set about using them to coordinate, and that's what Gleichschaltung literally translates as, to coordinate German life under his own centralised control from Berlin. So this is quite a large topic. We'll need 2 lessons to cover this topic, so this will be the first of 2 YouTube videos on this particular topic, and today's lesson will focus on how he in particular coordinated the working classes, but also the other political parties. And then in the second YouTube video lesson, which will follow on separately after this, we'll look at how he coordinated the states, the Länder, as they were called. Okay, so let's move on. As always, quite a few sort of business items before we get into the content, as we would do with any other lesson if we were in school. Just a reminder that I've written an essay about the National Uprising, which was included in the previous PowerPoint. Well, here, just sort of pull back a little bit. I've written another essay which basically gives a quick recap of all of Hitler's achievements by the 24th of March 1933. So as before with the first essay on the National Uprising, I won't read it to you, but I'll just zoom back a little bit, and of course, so you can pause the YouTube video and read it yourself. And of course, students in my history group, you can download this essay from Microsoft Teams. So there we are. So that was the situation when Hitler was appointed Chancellor, and then 8 weeks later, what has Hitler achieved? He has enormously increased his power. Just take the time to read that. Obviously, if I'm going too fast for you, you can just pause the YouTube video yourself. Okay, so as you can see, hopefully you've read that now. It is important you read that essay before we launch into this video, because as you can see, that essay acts as a bridge between the previous lessons and today's lesson. It basically introduces today's lesson of Gleichschaltung, and by considering and pulling together all of the aspects that we have covered so far. And the key message there, of course, is Hitler has achieved an enormous amount in a short period of time. That's less than 2 months since he was appointed Chancellor. that he has achieved by the 24th of March. And he's now set himself up with enormous powers, and as was pointed out by that essay, those two powers are arguably legally captured in two pieces of legislation. The first was the Reichstag Fire Decree, more properly called the Decree for the Power, the Decree for the Protection of People and State. That was passed on the 28th of February 1933, and then the Enabling Act that was passed on the 24th of March 1933. Let's move on. Okay, so as I said, quite a few bits of business before we get into the lesson properly. There's a quick knowledge retrieval for you. So again, I won't read the questions out, and you can pause the YouTube video to write down the answers to that, and then the next slide will give you the answers. But this is testing is the knowledge sticking, and that is important. Okay, so it's moving into your long-term memory. So there are the 20 questions and the 20 answers. Okay, so nothing new there. Those are all points that we've covered in the last 2 or 3 lessons. Just really testing. It is important that the knowledge sticks, that it doesn't just pass through your brain and disappear. It's all very well understanding while you listen to the lesson and make the notes, but if within a week you've forgotten the information, that's not putting yourself in a good position. And the way the brain works, you will forget that information very quickly unless you revisit it. Remember, it's about making the knowledge stick. As a reminder of where we are in terms of the depth study and the direction of travel, and in terms of the additional reading, so you can pick up all of this additional reading. Okay, so that is important, that you're sort of stretching yourself. That's part of making the knowledge stick, because each time you read again, read from a different source, you're coming across the same information presented in a different way by a different historian, and of course it's that repetition of revisiting the information that helps the knowledge move into your long-term memory. William Carr. That one I've highlighted. Excellent essay by Stephen J. Lee called "Was There a Legal Revolution?" Between 1933 and 1934. Make sure you read the original essay. Also make sure you read the background narrative that goes before it, and have a look at the sources at the end of the chapter that follow it. And the notes for that, I can give you my own notes, and even better, I can give you a YouTube video which you'll see in my playlist. There is a playlist about the Nazis' consolidation of power. If you subscribe to my channel, just go to that playlist and you'll see the video in there. If you're in my teaching group and you've downloaded the slideshow, you can access it directly by clicking on the link there. So that's the link here for the actual video, but the link for the playlist you can access by clicking there. And finally, you'll have seen on the opening contextual slide, the checklist, I referenced Noakes and Pridham. They're the editors of this volume of documents. An absolutely excellent book, first of a series of books actually. There were 4 volumes altogether. The first volume looked at, as you can see, the rise to power, up to not 1933, but took it as far as the end of 1934. So it also included the consolidation of power. And that final chapter in the book was called The Seizure of Power. So it's how Hitler turned his position of chancellorship into being a dictator. So this considers the whole thing about the national uprising. And the national uprising and the Enabling Act are considered there. I think, sorry, I apologise. I think that page number is actually wrong. I think that page at 143 takes you up to the Enabling Act, and I think it's the next section after that that looks at the coordination of the working classes and the political parties, which is what we're considering today. So you can see the subheadings in the chapter, so you can read on. Trying to pick out, read the documents. The documents really bring it alive for you. So try to pull out little quotes and set yourself the objective to memorise those quotes, commit them to memory, and then you can incorporate them into your essays, in particular introductions and conclusions. If you include little quotes, just short phrases and reference where you got them from, it really does add strength to your argument. Okay, so Hitler's increased powers by the 24th of March. So this here again is just repeating some of the key points that were in the essay that you read at the beginning of this YouTube video. So I won't read them all, but you can pause and have a quick look. So, two significant powers: Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act. Okay, and so from April to July 1933, which is what this video is about, Hitler set about using these powers to strengthen Nazi control even further. And in particular, there were three aspects of German life that necessarily needed to be brought into line, and that's what Gleichschaltung means: coordinate, bring into line. Because Hitler has seized control of the central government in Berlin, okay? But out there in Germany, this vast country, the 40-odd million German people are organised into lots of different organisations that the Nazis have not taken control of. So this is about, now that Hitler's got the powers of the Enabling Act, it's about using those powers to bring all those different aspects of German life into control. And there were three, as you can see, main areas that needed to be addressed immediately in Hitler's mind, and he wasted no time, so to the point that by the beginning of 1934 he had brought all these into line. Okay, and that's what these two lessons are about. First of all, he needed to get rid of any political parties other than the Nazi Party. We'll look at that this lesson. Secondly, he needed to bring into line the organisations that represented the millions of working class Germans, especially the trade unions, because the trade unions gave no loyalty to the Nazi Party. So we'll look at that, why that was important. And then in the next video, not this one, because it's in the next video, because this is a topic big enough for a whole video in itself, we'll look at how the 18 land, okay, in other words, the state governments, each of which had their own democratically elected parliament, the Landtag, which governed on local matters, how Hitler brought them under Nazi control, brought them into line. So that just sets the big picture of this lesson and next lesson. Okay, so in effect what we're saying is these are three case studies that we're covering these two lessons about how coordination worked. Okay, there were many other examples of organisations that the Nazis coordinated. Okay, it wasn't just these three. These are the three big ones. Okay, but organisations such as the media, the press, German businesses, youth organisations, and so on and so on. There were a multitude of organisations that the Nazis did not control at the beginning of 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor, and which he used the enabling powers given to him by the Enabling Act to bring them into line so that Hitler did control them. And to be accurate, with varying degrees of success, and I think that's really important to understand, with varying degrees of success. Okay, The three that we're looking at in these two lessons were largely very successful because these were so important to Hitler. He needed to bring them into line, that he needed to do it well. But there were many other organisations that the Nazis never really did coordinate, such as, for example, the Catholic Church, to a large extent the German businesses. Okay, but that's another topic. So there's our lesson, there's our mind map. And as you saw from the previous slide, I've created a series of question prompts for each of those three areas, which we'll revisit. They come back onto the screen in a second. But it's our traditional mind mapping approach. So we'll move into the first one, which is how Hitler coordinated the political parties. Okay, and those are the questions that should be sort of sitting there in your mind, and hopefully we will address them. What argument did Hitler use to persuade the political parties to voluntarily dissolve themselves? Which political parties put up the least resistance to dissolution? And which political party was the most resistant? Okay, so we'll move on. So there are those three questions. I forgot they were on the slide themselves. And here we have it in a nutshell. So I'll read through it. You do the mapping onto the mind map of the kit of the points as I read. Print off the mind map from Microsoft Teams, and then behind this there are further points that I've taken from the textbook, which you can also map on, and that's the sort of detail that you need. Remember, these in a nutshell slides are mainly about your understanding, just to make sure you understand, and then the detail that follows in the next slides, that's about the precise knowledge. It gives you the meat. Okay, so let's have a look. So in a nutshell, the passing of the Enabling Act provided the legal basis for Hitler now to declare that Germany was a one-party state. Okay, in a sense, there was no longer any point in Germany continuing as a multi-party system, and that's a key word to add to your vocabulary list to try to use. In a democracy such as we live in today, we call it a pluralist political system. A pluralist means many political parties are allowed to exist. And what Hitler is basically now saying is, I'm going to abolish pluralism and it will be a one-party system. There will only be one political party allowed, and that will be the Nazi party, the NSDAP. Okay. So why was that? After all, the approval of the Reichstag was no longer needed in the lawmaking process. The whole reason for the existence of political parties, the reason they exist, is so that other points of view of the people can be represented in the lawmaking process. Okay, that's why we have a parliament, and the German parliament was the Reichstag. So it provides a means to represent other points of view. So that's the reason for pluralism, is to ensure that other points of view are represented. So that ensures that when you have a proposed law, and remember, a proposed law is called a bill, for it to become a law, there needs to be majority approval in a vote, and the vote is by the representatives of the people. Okay, that's what lawmaking is about in a democracy, in a pluralist system. But if you don't have a parliament, if you don't have a Reichstag, there's little point in having different political parties. Okay, because the purpose of a parliament is to enable debate and discussion in order to pass a law. Okay, so that all points of view are considered, and then having listened to all points of view, the members of the parliament, the Reichstag, have a vote, and it has to be a majority. In other words, more than half the members of the parliament, the Reichstag, have got to approve the proposed law for it to become a law. So all points of view must be represented. There must be multiple parties to ensure that happens. But what the Enabling Act has done, of course, is it has basically said that process is no longer needed for lawmaking, that for the next 4 years, to create unity, there's no longer going to be any discussion, there's no longer going to be any debate, there's just going to be a decision made by Adolf Hitler, the Chancellor of Germany, in his cabinet. And so therefore, if you're not going to have discussion, there's no point in having political parties. Okay, basically. So that's our big number one reason. Okay, but there was another reason. Okay, and it kind of like links to it. Hitler's central message. Okay, ever since he had formed his Nazi party, or he didn't form it, but he joined it and he took over the leadership of it, was that Germany in the Weimar era was desperately weak. Okay, that the Weimar Germany was weak. And the reason that Germany was weak, according to Hitler, was that democracy divided Germany. The fact that the Germans were allowed to discuss and debate about the way they wanted to organise things, in Hitler's view, that was a bad thing, because debate and discussion will create different points of view, and different points of view will create division, and division will create weakness. Okay, so looking at that the reverse way, the way Hitler wants to do it is he wants to create strength. He wants Germany to grow, and for that to happen, all Germans now need to stand together. There must not be any debate any further. Okay, there needs to be a strong leader who tells them what the view is, and therefore there's only going to be one point of view, and that will therefore create unity. So there will be one ideology, one set of ideas that will be imposed on the German people, and that will create strength. So in effect, what Hitler has been pursuing, and he has now achieved it through the Enabling Act, is the message that disagreement with Hitler, who is the leader of the German people, and Hitler is moving to that title. Within the party, he's called himself Führer ever since 1920. He's not yet using that title for himself as the leader of Germany. He's still the Chancellor, but in his head, he wants to be the Führer. And Führer means an all-powerful leader for which there is absolutely no disagreement at all. Everybody must accept his point of view. So in Hitler's head, disagreement was tantamount to treason, because thinking it through, if you disagree with the single view, then you are creating division within your nation, and if you're dividing the nation, you are weakening the nation, you are weakening Germany, and Hitler's primary objective is to ensure that Germany is strong. And in Hitler's view, democracy, which of course we see fundamentally, quite rightly, in our world today, we see democracy as being fundamentally important and right and the right thing to do. But in Hitler's view, democracy, he equates it with national weakness, and it all goes back to the end of the First World War and Germany's defeat. Okay, so armed with these arguments, therefore, Hitler now has been given the powers, first of all given to him by the Reichstag Fire Decree. Sorry, that should be the 28th of February 1933. And remember, the proper name for that is the Decree for the Protection of People and State. And remember, that gave him two powers. It gave him the powers to arrest people and hold them indefinitely without trial. So that provided the basis for the concentration camps, the special prisons that Hitler created straight afterwards. And the second power from the Reichstag Fire Decree was the power to centralise all policing, the policing of Germany, in the hands of the central government, which Hitler leads, based in Berlin. So huge powers were given to him by the Reichstag Fire Decree, and then 4 weeks later, those powers were supplemented further by the powers given to him by the Enabling Act, which now allows Hitler to make laws by himself without going to the Reichstag or without going to the President, the head of state, President Hindenburg. Okay, so armed with those powers, he now intends to move against the different political parties. Okay, and by July 1933, he had achieved his objective. Didn't take long. Think about the months. It's March, end of March. That's April, May, June, July. Less than 4 months. Within less than 4 months, Hitler had Gleichschaltung. He had coordinated the political system so that there was only one party, the Nazi Party. So by the end of July 1933, all the other political parties, the Communists, the Social Democrats, the Centre Party, the German Nationalists, the German People's Party, etc., had gone. Okay? And that's it, they're gone. They simply did not exist anymore. And these were parties that had formed since 1871 as a fundamental part of what Germany was. Hitler wiped them out in 4 months. Okay? And what's important to understand is that although he forcibly dissolved, as we call it, most of the political parties, he didn't need to use force because many of them voluntarily closed themselves down. Okay, so and that's the detail that now sits underneath this. So we'll go on and have a look at that. So the passing of the Enable Act provided a legal justification for Hitler to create a one-party state. So there's the point about the Reichstag effectively being powerless. It continued to exist, but it didn't have a role anymore. So the whole of this national uprising election campaign, this massive propaganda wave the Nazis have launched the day after he became Chancellor, has presented that massive point to the German people: we need national unity. And therefore, the existence of a pluralist system is weakening the country. Okay? So by implication, if you are a member of another political party or you vote for another political party, you are basically weakening the nation. And that is equivalent to being a traitor. Okay? So there's a implicit or pretty much an explicit message there that a good German must support the Nazi Party. And if you support any other political party, by implication, you are weakening the nation. Okay, that is the fundamental message that was being given to the German people. And now Hitler has got the power to move on this. Okay, so he's basically saying to the other political parties, you've got a choice. Okay, if you're a good German, you will dissolve yourselves. So if you're the leader of the Catholic Centre Party, by implication, if you choose to continue, for your party to continue to exist, you are weakening Germany, because you are basically giving the German people a different point of view, and that is unacceptable. So therefore you should close your party down, and if you don't close your party down, then we will forcibly dissolve your party. And that in effect was the message that Hitler presented to the people immediately after the Enabling Act was signed, because he's saying, I've got the powers to do this, so it's your choice. Okay, and that really was where he moved for the next 4 years. Now, the SPD, the party on the left, were never going to close themselves down. Okay, they have fought long and hard. Just think about everything we've done in the course since the 1870s and since Germany came into existence, and Wilhelm Liebknecht and Bebel, the founders of the founders of social democracy in Germany, and this party, this great party that represented the working classes, that had risen to become the largest party in 1912. They're on the political left. They're internationalist. They're a party of the working classes. They are completely the opposite wing, opposite of the political spectrum to what the Nazis are. Okay, so they're not going to just go down. They've got mass support, huge support. Okay, so they needed to be forcibly coordinated. Okay, so Hitler wasted no time in moving against them. And here's the sort of like key events you need to be aware of. First of all, the SPD had been weakened by sustained SA violence during the national election campaign. Okay, that had weakened them. We talked about how it was very difficult for them to campaign. The street violence was used against any members of the party who tried to speak out on the streets, and as was their legal right. That had weakened their resolve that they'd be subject to enormous violence. It was also remarkable that in spite of all of that, when the vote took place, and we covered that in the lesson on the Enabling Act, 94 of their members had the moral courage to vote against the Enabling Act. So immediately after the Enabling Act, Hitler basically ordered the arrest of most who had voted against the Enabling Act. And so the days that followed the passing of the Enabling Act, Nazi stormtroopers arrested them and put many of the members of the Social Democrats into concentration camps, using the argument that they were traitors because they were internationalist in their beliefs. They were traitors. And of course, legally, the 28th of February decree, the Rostock-Fire decree, gave Hitler the authority to arrest people and impose them, put them in prison indefinitely. Finally, Hitler passed a law on the 19th of June 1933 that banned the Social Democrats. So this great party that had been built up over half a century, just destroyed like that. Okay, it's not there in the notes, I don't think, but it's so make sure you do make a note. The members, they had been weakened by the Great Depression. Okay, that's an important thing, and we'll pick that up when we look at the working classes in a few minutes. Okay, supporters of the SPD experienced ongoing political violence afterwards, because many of them just refused to accept it. So a wave of astonishing violence by Hitler's stormtroopers, the Köpenick Blood Week, at the 21st, 26th of June, in a suburb of Berlin, a working class suburb of Berlin. Social Democratic Party member Anton Schmaus was arrested, there's a picture of him there on the right, after shooting 3 SA men, and more than 500 SPD members were arrested and tortured. And that, in a sense, broke the SA, it broke the will of the SA, or certainly made them realise that there was no future for them in Germany. So after that, the main emphasis was to get out of Germany and to regroup. So they fled to Czechoslovakia, to the Czech city of Prague, and they basically regrouped in Prague, and they did maintain an underground network of working class contacts in Germany who, at great risk to themselves, smuggled reports out to Prague, giving information to the SPD about the mood in Germany and the potential of the working classes rising up against the Nazi regime, which was a pretty bleak prospect because the potential was very, very difficult. So that's the SPD. Let's just move on. The Centre Party. Okay, so that's going to the middle then. Okay, they voluntarily dissolved themselves. As we've seen, the Centre Party, the ZP as they're called, had moved to the political right since 1929. They had become fairly right-wing. They're quite nationalist. Many of the members of the Centre Party admired many things that Hitler believed in. And so many members of the Centre Party were convinced that a short period of strong government was necessary. Okay, not all members, but there was that argument, there was that belief, and some members were saying, well, you know, okay, we don't like much of what Hitler stands for, we don't like his violence, but he is restoring law and order, he is crushing communism, he has destroyed the extreme left wing, and although we've got moral reservations about him, because obviously the Centre Party are Christian, that we must respect that, in a sense, his intentions beneath it all are coming from the right place. And of course they were deluding themselves to say those sorts of things, but we know that with hindsight. Many of the things that we, of course, associate the Nazis with, the evil things that happened, to a large extent were hidden and were not so explicit at that particular point, his treatment of the Jews and so on and so forth. Yes, people knew that he hated the Jews, but what he eventually did, of course, hadn't happened at that point. So as a result, many of the 91 members of the ZP voted for the Enabling Act, and we did that last lesson, okay, and that was a key factor in it being passed. But much of that was about self-preservation too. So the ZP continued to have doubts about Hitler, but their resolve was further weakened in July 1933, and we'll cover this in a later lesson, by a deal that Hitler signed with the Pope. Okay, and remember, the Pope is the head of the Catholic Church, and the Centre Party is a political party that represents Catholics. And when Hitler signed this deal with the Pope, and basically the deal was two-way promise. Hitler promised to respect Catholic institutions in Germany and to not bring them under control. Okay, so he basically said Germans can continue to go to church every Sunday, etc., etc. So in return, the Pope instructed German Catholics to stay out of political activities, to not give comment on politics. And that, in a sense, completely pulled the rug out of the Centre Party's feet, because the whole purpose of the Centre Party was to give a voice for German Catholics in politics. So if the Pope is instructing them to stay out of politics, then there was no point in the Centre Party existing. So on the 5th of July 1933, the Centre Party voluntarily dissolved themselves. Now, I know they did that before the Concordat was signed, but they could see it coming, and effectively the lack of resolve, their willingness, their ability and their willingness to stand up had been fundamentally weakened. So that's the Centre Party. Other right-wing parties, such as the German Nationalist Party, that Hitler's coalition partners, wholeheartedly threw themselves into this melting pot, and they voluntarily dissolved themselves anyway, because they basically fundamentally had put Hitler into power, supported his rise to power, because they believed in what he stood for, and they continued to believe that they could control Hitler, but they believed it was important, therefore, to lead by example and to dissolve themselves. And so many members of the German Nationalist Party then ended up joining the Nazi Party. Okay, so that was that. Okay, the Communist Party, of course, on the far left, we haven't specifically mentioned. Maybe I should have put that into the notes, but we covered that in the previous lesson. They had basically been declared an enemy of the state with the Reichstag fire way back at the end of February. And the wave of action against them culminated in the fact they couldn't even vote for the Enabling Act. So the Communist Party had been closed down as well. And like the SPD, went into exile. So there's another knowledge retrieval. This one I've taken the approach with them before. Okay, so remember, it's about making knowledge stick. So there are 5 questions there from the last lesson. There are 4 questions from last month, and then there are 3 questions that go back even further, okay? So you can pause the video, write down the answers to those 12 questions, and then the answers are on the next slide. Okay, so there are the answers. So just check off how well you did, and again, you should be doing this yourself, okay? It shouldn't require me to be doing this for you. I'll do it occasionally to help you, but this is about making the knowledge stick. Okay, and those, just revisit those 3 questions. So hopefully now you can answer those 3 questions. You've got the information, the knowledge and the understanding to articulate those points with supporting detail and evidence. Okay, so there we are. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do our second strand, the working classes. But as I say, the third strand, the coordination of the states, we'll do in a separate YouTube video. Okay, so we'll finish off this YouTube video today now by looking at the working classes. So again, there are some key questions. Okay, hopefully in 15 minutes or so you'll be confident you can answer those questions. Why did the working classes need coordinating? Why was it so easy for Hitler to crush the trade unions? Was the German Labour Front a Nazi trade union? And was the German Labour Front ideologically aligned to Nazi goals? Okay. So, in a nutshell, all of those questions are answered on the screen here, and then there's the detail sits beneath it. Okay. So, in a nutshell, Hitler's core message was that for Germany to be strong, Germans need to be united. We've done that. And for Germans to be united, all Germans needed to identify first and foremost with one nation, Germany. Okay, we've done that. And that one leader that represented the nation. There's now just a single leader who has all the power. Okay, so we've done that. Okay, so clearly then, the existence of, quote, socialist, unquote, organisations. In other words, organisations that represented the working classes weaken Germany. Socialist organisations weaken Germany. Okay, why do they weaken Germany? Because by definition, and we covered this a few minutes ago, if you've got an organisation that represents just one social class, such as the working classes, then it is basically creating division within the country. Okay. Hitler wants all Germans, whether you are working class or middle class or upper class, to pull together, and they should love each other as fellow Germans. But if you as a German person identify with your social class, I am a working class, and therefore I don't like the middle and the upper classes, then you are weakening Germany because you are identifying with only one group of Germans. Okay, so that's basically the fundamental point. And so Hitler fundamentally needs to tackle the working classes, because the working classes are very, very well organised, and most of the working classes do not identify themselves with Germany. They identify themselves as being working class. They don't like the middle and the upper classes. And they're represented in two ways. First of all, they're represented through the left-wing political parties. Now, there are two left-wing political parties. There is the KPD, the Communists, and there's the SPD, the Social Democrats. Think of our political spectrum. So that's how they're represented politically. And then in the workplace, they're represented by the trade unions. Okay. So the trade in the workplace, when working classes go to work, let's say they go to a factory, they are not thinking, everybody working in this factory are great people because we're all Germans. They're thinking, I'm one of the people down on the shop floor working on the machines. The people upstairs working in the offices, they are the enemy. They're the bosses. Okay, so there is division within the workplace. So the purpose of trade unions is formed way back decades before in the Second Reich. The purpose of trade unions is to fight for the rights of the workers, not to be taken advantage of by the bosses upstairs. Okay, so Hitler doesn't like the trade unions because the trade unions, by definition, are encouraging the working classes to think the wrong way. What Hitler wants to do is Hitler wants to get the working classes to love the bosses upstairs because they are Germans like them. Hitler wants the working classes to love the middle and the upper classes because they are Germans like them. Okay, so these organisations, the political parties like the KPD and the SPD and the trade unions, have got to basically be got rid of. Okay. Another point, of course, with these socialist organisations like the left-wing political parties and the trade unions, in Hitler's mind, by definition, they're international, because their outlook, remember, is Marxist. Okay, the left-wing views are motivated by the writings of Karl Marx, and that is international. Okay, workers of the world unite against the rich of the world. And so this again fundamentally goes back to, you may want to play that YouTube video that I've referred to you on many occasions. You'll see it in one of the playlists about left-wing views. So in Hitler's view, the working classes cannot really be trusted because their loyalties, shaped over decades and decades, are not to Germany, but they're to the workers of the world. their loyalties lie outside Germany. Okay, and in Hitler's view, their loyalties should be to their fellow Germans. So that really sort of sets the context. Hitler has got to crush the socialist organisations that represent the working classes. He must waste no time. And Hitler knows this because, again, think about the election result of the 5th of March 1933. Great result for the Nazis, but they only won 44% of the vote. The 56% who did not vote for the Nazis, the vast majority of them voted for either the SPD or the communists. So clear evidence that the workers in Hitler's mind can't be trusted as long as they have political parties of their own and as long as they have the trade unions to identify with. So the point is, and there is the phrase, what Hitler then did, he did remarkably easily. Okay, he was able to crush these working class organisations with incredible ease. Why? In part because the Great Depression had weakened the ability, had weakened the resolve of the working classes. It had weakened them. So an example of that, the trade unions were weak because of the Great Depression. The Great Depression led to 6 million Germans losing jobs. Okay, so just think that one through. Many of those workers who lost jobs were working classes. So let's say you are a businessman, you're running a business, you employ the working classes in the manufacturing process. The whole purpose of a trade union is to fight for the rights of the workers who have got jobs in your business, to fight for decent pay so that the boss pays them decent pay, treats them properly. If the boss doesn't treat them properly, the main weapon of the unions is to go on strike, will refuse to work. But if you've got 6 million workers out there who've lost their jobs, then the boss can say, well, I'm not interested. If you want to go on strike, I'll simply sack you, because I've got plenty of other unemployed workers who will very happily take your job at a lower pay. So therefore the unions don't really have much teeth. They haven't got any comeback. The threat of a strike isn't really going to have much impact when you've got 6 million workers unemployed. Okay, so that's the sort of point there. But the other thing, and this is so fundamental, this one here, another reason that the ability of the political left, the working classes, to resist this onslaught by the Nazis, was the political left wing was tragically divided. There were two left-wing political parties. There were two working class political parties. There were, of course, the SPD, who were the moderate socialists, and there were the KPD, who were the extreme socialists. Now, if there had been just one Marxist political party, then Hitler would have had a huge problem, because there would have been a united resistance by the working classes against the Nazis. But because the working classes were divided into two political parties, and the great problem is, those two political parties, even though they were both Marxists, they were more interested in fighting against each other than joining together to fight against Hitler. So the fact that there was division in the political left fundamentally weakened the ability of the working classes to resist Hitler, the Nazi onslaught. So that's a fundamental weakness. Hitler also, to some extent, wrong-footed the working classes by what he then did. Okay, after breaking the trade unions and the political parties, Hitler suddenly created his own, in effect, Nazi working class organisations, and the biggest one was called the German Working Front. And in a sense, that duped, it fooled the working classes. Okay, they were stunned. They lost all of their old representation, and suddenly the Nazis gave them a Nazi working class organisation that claimed to represent and support the German workers, but in reality it didn't. Okay, although it claimed that, in reality it was just a Nazi organisation that was a means of controlling the working classes. And in reality, over the next 12 years, the bosses, the people running the businesses, were the real power force in industry and in the workforce. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. The detail that sits beneath it, we'll just finish off by having a look at that in the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes of this lesson. So just to make sure we're clear about that. So there's that first, we made that point. The Nazis had never been won over to the Nazi court, so the working classes had never been won over. Remember, 56% of Germans did not vote for the Nazis on the 5th of March 1933, and many of those 56% were the working classes. Okay, there's that 56% figure there. The socialist trade unions had more than 4 million members, and that was going to be a problem for Hitler. Okay, so the trade unions represent the working classes, and they don't identify with the German nation. They simply identify with supporting the working classes. They don't support the middle classes, the upper classes. So that's that one. Number 3, the socialist trade unions hope to preserve their independence by promising to remove their association with the SPD and cooperate with the Nazis. That's an additional point, and that was in a sense part of the a weakness that Hitler really exploited. That the trade unions wanted to cooperate. They could see the physical threat against them. They could see the stormtroopers, and they could see what the Nazi violence and how that would be used against the communists. And the trade unions were run by decent people they were law-abiding people. They wanted to work within the system. They had families, and they didn't want to end up in concentration camps. They were not radicals. They were not did not want to fight on the streets. They wanted to work with the government. Okay. That's what trade unions do. So in horror, watching this sort of onslaught of violence against the communists during the National Uprising campaign, many of these trade union leaders, or the trade unions leadership, had made soundings to Hitler. We want to do it properly. If it helps, we will stay out of politics. We'll just stick to fighting for pay, and that we won't comment on political issues. So that's why they promised to remove their association with the SPD, which was the political wing of the working classes. But Hitler wasn't interested. Okay, but remember what we said about Hitler's political cunning. He was, put aside his innate evilness. He was an astute politician. So what Hitler did is he declared the 1st of May to be a national day of labour, to celebrate the working classes. So you can imagine the working classes and the trade unions thought, whoa, this is good. This guy, maybe he's not as bad as we thought he was. He suddenly said, every 1st of May we'll celebrate the working classes. Okay, have a day's holiday. But then the very next day, the 2nd of May 1933, and you can almost sort of visualise that the working classes have had a big national holiday and they've had a celebration, and they've probably been out partying, and they're waking up on the next day, the 2nd of May, hungover. And what then happened is the stormtroopers stormed the trade union officers and arrested the trade union leaders. So there's a classic example of carrot and stick. The wolf in lamb's clothing. Hitler pretended to be a lamb, and then suddenly the wolf appeared the next day. So in addition to that, many trade unions were associated with the Catholic Church, the Catholic trade unions. And of course, when the Catholic Centre Party dissolved themselves on the 5th of July, the Catholic trade unions voluntarily dissolved themselves as well as part of that agreement. Okay, and the Catholic Trade Union organisation was a big, powerful, substantial chunk of the trade union movement, so that's an important one to mention as well. The trade unions then were replaced with the German Labour Front. Okay, so let's look at that. Okay, so the German Labour Front. So notice the date, 4 days after the crushing of the trade unions, suddenly, and the workers are suddenly reading with that, they've been told the Nazis celebrated the workers, then the Nazis crushed the trade unions. Then suddenly 4 days later, Hitler made a big announcement, we love the workers, and so we're going to form a German Labour Front. Okay? And this is a really good example of Gleichschaltung in action. Now, what Hitler basically said is the German Labour Front was an organisation run by the Nazis that would look after the interests of the German working classes. It would make sure that the German working classes were well paid and had good working conditions, and that they would be looked after and valued. Okay, that was basically the clear message, the German Labour Front. Very clear message that they were the DAF, as it was called, was the only legal institution for workers in Germany. From this point on, if you're a working class person, you are represented by the German Labour Front, but there's no other organisation out there that is legal to represent the working classes. From now on, the political parties, the communists and the SPD have been outlawed. The trade unions have been outlawed. Okay. So all other labour unions were very quickly outlawed. Okay, that's part of the Gleichschaltung, and if they refused to cooperate, their leaders would be thrown into concentration camps. So, to be clear, although Hitler claimed that the DAF was there to look after the interests of the workers, they were not established to defend workers' rights and pay, as the old trade unions had done. The purpose of the DAF was to control the workers. It was to ensure that they were not given any opportunity to grumble against the Nazi state, to organise themselves against the Nazi state. So it basically was to make sure that every aspect of their lives, their leisure activity, their working life, was at all times under supervision, so that they were being watched over, so that they could not organise themselves. So all previous contracts between workers and employers were dissolved, and so every workplace, every business, of course, would have a contract between the workers and the bosses. Well, the fact that a contract existed implied that the workers had rights, so they were all abolished. The workers don't have any rights. A camouflage was created, so new contracts were drawn up, but the new contracts basically clearly, they talked about harmony in the workplace, and that there needed to be trust in the workplace, that workers and bosses must work together because we're all Germans, and there must be no division within the workplace. That the language must be one of harmony, the bosses and the workers love each other and will work together at all times. So these new contracts just basically made very clear that workers had to be told had to do what they were going to be told to do, full stop. And we can see that because it was shown in their hours over the next few years steadily increased, and their wages froze. In other words, the working class standard of living got worse during the Nazi period. Okay, they were told that their life was getting better. The propaganda message was the lives of the workers is improving, and to some extent it did, because when Hitler took power, there were 6 million workers out of work, and of course Hitler introduced work schemes, he introduced rearmament, and so there was always jobs in the Third Reich. There was no unemployment, people had occupations, so on that level Hitler could claim to have solved the unemployment problem, and of course many workers appreciated that, and they thought this is good, things have improved because we've got jobs. But beneath it all, their hours were long and their wages were low, and they were not trusted, and so their leisure time was massively controlled at all times by the Nazi state. Okay, so the person in charge of the DAF, often known as the Reich drunkard, was this man, Robert Lai. Okay, so he's an interesting one. So he, as the leader of the DAF, established the goal. All Germans engaged in the life of labour defined the goals of the DAF. Now, what's interesting though is that, do you remember the whole definition of the Nazi Party? N stands for nationalist, D stands for German. So they're very much right-wing, national German. But they were called the NS, S stands for socialist, and the A stands for workers, Arbeiter, P for party. And those two terms, socialist and workers, were put into the name of the party. And they were largely put in the name of the party just simply as a ruse to pull the working classes away from internationalism, to get them to support right-wing movements, nationalist and German movements. But nevertheless, there were some Nazis who took very seriously the S and the A. They said, look, we do genuinely need to look after the interests of the workers. Okay, and Robert Lai actually took very seriously that. It was his group. He believed that it was crucial that the Nazis provided some form of representation and benefits for the German workers. And especially from 1936 onwards, when the German regime began to heavily focus on rearmament and preparing for war, Lai consistently argued that unless we treat the workers well, productivity will decrease. We're not going to produce lots of weapons if the workers are unhappy, because they're just going to work reluctantly. And he argued that we're going to start seeing workers being off sick, and there is the potential that workers will sabotage, they will break machines and etc. They'll find other ways of protesting. So actually what therefore happened is this mass organisation that was formed to control the German workers under Robert Lai, it did actually work against the bosses to some extent. So when the bosses, and Hitler very much backed the employers because Hitler wanted weapons to be made, etc. So when the bosses sort of like tried to increase workers' hours and freeze their pay, the DAF did actually put up some resistance. Okay, so this is an important issue. There was a bit of a gap between what the Nazis claimed and what actually turned out. So the DAF did become quite a powerful force because they did genuinely believe in these sort of socialist workers aspects that were embedded in the Nazi name. We'll do more on that in later lessons when we look about this issue of efficiency, and was the Nazi state really how efficient was it? And of course there's a big argument that it was actually very chaotic, and that's part of the chaos argument. Okay, so there are the original questions. Hopefully then we've answered all of those, and you can rate yourselves on those key questions there. There we are. We've mapped up to that particular point. And I'll pause then, stop this video, because the next one, the coordination of the federal states, is a biggie. If I were to sort of like launch into that one now, there'd be at least another half hour, probably longer, of our video. So I'm going to take a breath, pause, finish this one, and then I'll do a separate video, and that will be a separate lesson. So speaking to my Year 12 history group, today's lesson is what we've just done today, and then the next lesson we will, and I know we're in lockdown and so you're working from home, but the next lesson will be on the coordination of the states. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was useful for you. I'll sign out now.